The wind shrieked through the frozen valley, carrying with it sheets of biting snow. It howled through the mountains like a relentless beast, swallowing everything in a blinding white fury. Trees bent under the force, their branches cracking like distant gunfire. The small mountain town below had long since gone silent, its residents huddled inside against the storm's wrath. Outside, the world was a void, directionless and merciless, a place where even the strong would falter. Mark pulled his coat tighter, his breath escaping in thick clouds. Each step was a battle, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He leaned forward against the gusts, his gloved hands clenched into fists. The cold gnawed at his exposed skin, and his cabin, his solitary refuge, felt impossibly far away. He should have left earlier. He knew better. Now, the storm was swallowing the world, and he was just another lost soul fighting against nature's wrath. Solitude had been Mark's only companion for years. After the accident, after losing them, he had withdrawn from the world, finding solace in isolation. The cabin was a self-imposed exile, a place where memories couldn't suffocate him. He lived by the seasons, spoke to no one, answered no calls. He had convinced himself that this was how it had to be, because the weight of loss was easier to bear alone than shared. And yet, sometimes, in the dead of night, the loneliness clawed at him like a phantom. Through the howl of the blizzard, a sound cut through, small, weak, nearly swallowed by the wind. A whimper. Mark froze, the snow stinging his face. For a moment he doubted himself. The wind played tricks, twisting sound into ghosts. But then, there it was again, thin, fragile, desperate. His pulse quickened. He turned his head, scanning the storm. The sound was coming from nearby, barely audible over the chaos of the wind. Mark's first instinct was to ignore it. It wasn't his problem. He had enough ghosts haunting him. But his feet refused to move forward. Another whimper, weaker this time. Something out there was dying. His hands clenched. He could turn away, return to the warmth of his cabin. But then what? Live with the knowledge that he had ignored a life in need? With a heavy sigh, he turned, trudging toward the sound. Snow caked the remains of an old, collapsed shed, half buried beneath the storm's fury. Mark pushed forward, his boots crunching against ice, and then he saw it. A German shepherd, curled around two tiny pups, her fur matted with ice, her body shivering violently. Her eyes met his, wide with fear, but brimming with desperate hope. She didn't move, didn't growl. She only clutched her puppies closer, shielding them from the cold with the last of her strength. Mark swallowed hard. Against every instinct to stay detached, he knew he couldn't leave them there. He had to save them. The wind howled through the trees, carrying icy shards of snow that stung Mark's exposed skin. He knelt on the threshold, staring at the frail German shepherd before him. Her ribs jutted against her thin coat, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Yet, despite her weakness, her golden brown eyes held fierce determination. She crouched low, shielding two tiny pups pressed against her belly. A guttural growl, more a whisper than a threat, escaped her throat. The storm had stolen her strength, but she refused to surrender. She was a mother, and she would fight until her last breath. Mark had lived in solitude for years, preferring silence to human connection. Yet, as he watched the mother dog tremble with exhaustion but refused to abandon her pups, something unexpected tightened in his chest. He recognized that look, pure, unyielding love. It stirred something deep within him, something he had long buried. His hands clenched into fists against the cold, uncertainty gnawing at him. He had sworn never to care again, yet here he was, heart pounding, feeling the unmistakable pull of responsibility. He took a cautious step forward. The mother dog's ears flattened. With the last ounce of her strength, she snapped at the air between them. A warning, a desperate plea to stay away. Mark froze. He understood that defiance. He had lived it. She had failed before, abandoned, betrayed. Her snarl wasn't just instinct, it was history. He exhaled, slow and deliberate. Earning her trust wouldn't be easy, but time was running out, and those pups wouldn't survive the night. Mark shrugged off his heavy coat, kneeling to make himself smaller, less threatening. He extended a hand, palm up, his voice steady despite the biting wind. "Easy, girl, I'm not here to hurt you." The mother dog's hackles remained raised, her body rigid with fear. But something flickered in her eyes. Doubt, hesitation. He inched forward, his coat a makeshift barrier against the cold. "You don't have to do this alone," he murmured. The snow thickened around them, the pups barely visible beneath their mother's trembling form. Mark had to act now, before it was too late. The snowfall turned relentless, thick and suffocating. Mark knew he had only minutes before the storm became impassable. The mother dog's breath came in short, uneven bursts. Her pups, no bigger than his palm, barely moved. If he left them there, they wouldn't see the morning. He glanced back at his cabin, warmth, safety, then at the mother dog, still torn between instinct and desperation. His fingers numbed as he reached for the nearest pup. "I know you're scared," he said softly, "but if we stay out here, none of us make it." The mother dog's body tensed as Mark's hand neared her pup. He held his breath. One wrong move, and she could lash out. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, just as he thought she might attack, she faltered. Her ears drooped slightly, her body shuddering from cold and exhaustion. Her eyes, once hardened with distrust, now shimmered with something else. Surrender, or maybe the smallest sliver of hope. Mark seized the moment, scooping up the tiny pup in his arms. The first pup barely stirred in his grasp, its fragile body barely warmer than the snow beneath it. Mark cradled it against his chest, tucking it into his coat. He reached for the second. Another sharp gust of wind sent snow spiraling around them, nearly blinding him. The mother dog whined, but didn't stop him this time. Slowly, carefully, Mark rose, the pups secure in his arms. "Come on," he urged, stepping back toward the cabin. The mother dog hesitated, her muscles coiled as if ready to bolt. But then, with a limping step, she followed. Mark pushed the cabin door open, warmth spilling into the icy night. The mother dog hovered at the threshold, her paws sinking into the deep snow. He crouched low, meeting her gaze. "It's safe," he promised. She hesitated, torn between fear and the undeniable instinct to protect her young. Then, with a weary breath, she stepped forward. The door closed behind her, shutting out the storm. Mark exhaled, realizing the weight of what had just happened. She had trusted him, just enough to take a chance. Inside, the air was thick with warmth. Mark set the pups down on a thick blanket near the fire, rubbing their tiny bodies to coax life back into them. The mother dog, shaking but alert, curled protectively around them, her body finally allowed a moment's rest. Mark grabbed another blanket, draping it over her frail form. "You did good," he murmured. The mother dog lifted her head, eyes meeting his, no longer filled with fear, just exhaustion, relief. For the first time in years, Mark felt something foreign yet familiar settle deep in his chest, something like belonging. The fire crackled softly, casting golden light against the log walls. Mark sat on the floor, watching the mother dog breathe steadily for the first time. The pups twitched in their sleep, their tiny bodies no longer trembling. Outside, the storm raged on, but here there was peace. Mark reached out, hesitating before letting his hand brush against the mother dog's fur. She didn't flinch. Instead, her weary eyes met his, silent gratitude, unspoken trust. He had saved them. But as the weight in his chest lifted, he realized the truth. They had saved him too. Mark sat by the fire, watching the German shepherd curled around her pups. Her amber eyes flickered with exhaustion, yet there was something unbreakable in them, something fierce. "Freya," he murmured. "That's what I'll call you. Strong, a fighter, just like you should have been treated." The mother dog lifted her head slightly, ears twitching at the unfamiliar sound of her new name. Mark wasn't sure she understood, but he repeated it softly. Freya. For the first time in years, he felt like he had named something, claimed something as his own. Not as a possession, but as a promise. A survivor deserved recognition. Mark placed a plate of cooked meat a few feet from Freya. She tensed, her ribs visible beneath her thin fur, hunger battling with wariness. He didn't move, letting her decide. After a long pause, she crept forward, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the food. A quick glance at Mark, measuring, calculating, before she took the first cautious bite. Then another. Mark remained still, his heart pounding with something unfamiliar. He'd seen starvation before, in himself, in others. But watching an animal, a mother, fight through fear for survival was different. When she finished, she didn't retreat as far as before, just a little closer. Mark exhaled, knowing trust wasn't given freely. It was earned, and tonight he had earned just a sliver of hers. As Freya shifted, Mark noticed scars hidden beneath her thickening coat, old wounds, jagged and rough. Some ran along her back, others near her ribs. His fists clenched. He had seen cruelty in people, but seeing it on her made his stomach twist. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he whispered. She didn't flinch at his voice this time, only lowered her head protectively over her pups. Mark wondered what kind of hands had hurt her, what kind of world had turned her into a creature of survival rather than trust. Mark didn't reach out, he wouldn't force anything. But in that moment he made a silent vow. Whatever had hurt her before, whoever had hurt her, she would never know that kind of pain again. The wind howled outside, snow rattling against the window. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the small cabin. Freya stretched her legs slightly, no longer curled as tightly as before. She no longer flinched when Mark moved, though her eyes still followed his every motion. Progress, he thought. He reached for another log, and this time, Freya didn't retreat at the sudden movement. Instead, she sighed, resting her head on her paws. The storm outside was unforgiving, but in this moment, within these walls there was warmth. There was safety. And for the first time, Freya seemed to believe it. Mark had never been much for talking. Words were empty, unreliable. But now, in the quiet of his cabin, with only Freya and the pups as an audience, he found himself speaking. "I used to have someone," he murmured, staring into the fire. She loved the snow, like this, said it made the world quieter, said it gave people time to think. Freya listened, her ears flicking at his voice. But then she was gone, and the silence, it stopped being peaceful. Freya didn't move away. She simply watched him, golden eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Mark had no idea why he was telling her this. Why words, so useless before, now came so easily. Maybe because she didn't expect anything from him. She just listened. Freya didn't speak, of course, but she didn't need to. When Mark paused, lost in memories that still ached, she didn't pull away. She didn't shift or lower her gaze. Instead, she did something unexpected. She moved a little closer, not much. Just enough for Mark to notice, just enough for him to understand that, in her own way, she was offering comfort. He let out a breath, shaking his head. Didn't expect a dog to be a better listener than most people. Freya simply blinked, as if to say, "I understand loss too." And somehow, that unspoken truth made the silence feel a little less empty. The cabin had settled into an easy stillness, until a sharp noise from outside shattered it. A metallic clatter, something heavy shifting. Mark sat up, heart pounding. Freya was already on her feet, her body tense, ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in her throat. Mark reached for the rifle near the door, his pulse quickening. He hadn't had visitors in years. No one had reason to be out in a storm like this. Freya took a step forward, positioning herself between Mark and the door. Protective, alert. The noise came again, closer this time. Freya's growl deepened, a sound that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Someone, or something, was out there. Mark gripped the rifle, rising to his feet. He didn't know what was out there, but he knew one thing: he wasn't alone in facing it. Freya stood firm, muscles coiled, ready to defend. The scars on her body told a story of suffering, but at this moment she wasn't just surviving. She was guarding, protecting. Mark opened the door slightly, the icy wind biting at his skin. Shadows stretched across the snow. He held his breath. Then, a rustling in the trees. A pair of glowing eyes in the distance before vanishing into the dark. Mark exhaled, locking the door. "Just a scavenger," he muttered, setting the rifle down. Freya didn't relax immediately. Her gaze remained locked on the door, her stance unwavering. Mark looked at her, realization settling deep in his chest. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was protecting him too. The fire crackled softly, casting warm shadows across the wooden walls of the cabin. Mark exhaled, letting the day's exhaustion melt into the quiet. Beside him, Freya lay curled up, her breathing steady, her presence a comfort. Then, a sharp knock at the door. Mark tensed. Freya's ears perked, her body shifting as if sensing an unseen threat. Another knock, harder this time. A gust of wind howled through the cracks of the cabin, but it wasn't the storm outside that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Freya let out a low, uneasy whine. Mark pulled the door open just enough to see outside. A man stood there, bundled in a thick coat, his face shadowed by the dim porch light. His gaze swept past Mark, landing directly on Freya. "That's my dog," the man said, his voice rough, certain. He pulled a faded photograph from his pocket, holding it up like undeniable proof. Mark's stomach tightened. The photo, a dog, similar to Freya, same fur pattern, same soulful eyes, stared back at him. Freya didn't move. Mark glanced down. Freya stood frozen at his feet, ears flattened, tail tucked so tightly against her belly it nearly disappeared. A shiver ran through her body, her muscles stiff with something deeper than fear, dread. Mark had never seen her like this. Never. His chest tightened as she pressed herself closer to him, her silent plea clear. "Don't let him take me?" Mark hesitated. Could it be true? Freya had appeared out of nowhere, surviving in the wild. She had a past before him, one she couldn't tell. His mind raced. Was this man someone who had lost his dog and searched tirelessly to bring her home? Or was Freya running from something far worse? He looked at the photo again. The resemblance was undeniable. But the way Freya trembled at the sight of him, The way her eyes screamed for Mark to protect her. Something wasn't right. The man took a step closer. "Look, I don't want trouble. Just give me my dog." His tone sharpened, the softness from before peeling away. Freya flinched. Her body tensed, and then a deep, guttural growl rumbled from her chest. Mark had never heard her sound like that. Not when she was scared, not even when she was cornered. This wasn't fear, this was a warning. Mark inhaled deeply, then met Freya's gaze. Wide, pleading, trusting. She wasn't just a stray he had taken in, she had chosen him. And now, he had to make a choice too. His fingers tightened around the doorframe as he turned back to the man. "She's not your dog." The words came out firm, final. Freya didn't move, but Mark felt the slight shift in her body. Relief. The stranger's expression darkened. His lips curled, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You have no right to keep her," he spat. "You don't know anything about her." Mark squared his shoulders, unflinching. "Neither do you." The man took another step forward, anger radiating off him like heat from a wildfire. Mark braced himself. But before the man could move closer, Freya lunged. A bark tore through the cabin's silence, sharp and commanding. She sprang forward, teeth bared, her stance rigid, protective. Not just protecting herself, protecting Mark. The man stumbled back, startled. His confidence cracked under the sheer force of Freya's fury. Mark stepped beside her, his voice steady. "Leave. Now, or deal with both of us." Freya's growl remained steady, her body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The man hesitated. He saw it now, the unbreakable bond between them, the line he could not cross. A flicker of frustration crossed the man's face, but he knew when he was beaten. Muttering curses under his breath, he turned on his heel, disappearing into the night. The storm swallowed him whole. Mark exhaled, tension melting from his shoulders. Beside him, Freya let out a small, shuddering breath. Mark knelt, running a hand over Freya's head. She leaned into him, her weight pressing against him in silent gratitude. "You're safe," he whispered. She looked up at him, those same soulful eyes, no longer filled with fear, but with something deeper. Trust, loyalty, home. Mark knew then it had never been about who owned her. Freya had already made her choice, and so had he. The winter's grip finally loosened, and the first signs of spring crept into the landscape. Snowbanks melted into streams, and the once barren trees whispered with the promise of renewal. Inside the cabin, the change was even more profound. Freya stretched lazily by the hearth, her coat sleek and healthy, while her pups, now sturdy and playful, tumbled over one another in a joyful tangle. Mark, watching them, felt something stir within him, something long buried. The weight in his chest had lessened, replaced by a quiet warmth that had once felt impossible. Life, against all odds, was beginning anew. Mark no longer spent his evenings in silence. Where once the cabin echoed with emptiness, it now brimmed with the lively barks and playful yips of Freya's growing pups. She remained his shadow, always close, her eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. The loneliness that had clung to him for years had softened, replaced by an undeniable presence, family. For the first time in a long while, he didn't just exist, he lived. And he was no longer alone. The cabin, once a refuge of solitude, had transformed. The table, where dust had settled for years, now bore the evidence of shared meals, the floor scattered with chew toys and tiny paw prints. The old rocking chair by the fire, once a lonely perch, was now a place where Mark sat with Freya curled beside him, her warmth a silent reassurance. Laughter, his laughter, filled the space at odd moments, startling even himself. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of life within these walls. Mark knew he couldn't keep all the pups, no matter how much he wanted to. They deserved the kind of love and care he had found with Freya. So, with a heavy heart, he journeyed to town, each step more difficult than the last. He carefully chose homes for them, ensuring they would be cherished and safe. 2 remained, Freya's smallest, a mirror of her mother, and the boldest of the litter, the one who never left Mark's side. As he held them close, he whispered, "You're home, just like your mother." And in their eyes he saw trust. The path to the small, secluded grave was familiar, though it had been years since he last walked it. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth and pine as Mark approached Freya at his side. He knelt, brushing away the leaves that had settled over the gravestone. "You'd have loved her," he murmured, his fingers tracing the name etched in stone. Freya pressed her head against his shoulder, sensing the weight of the moment. Mark exhaled deeply. For the first time in years, the grief didn't crush him. It simply lived alongside the love. Freya nudged Mark's hand, her amber eyes locking onto his. There was no need for words. She understood his sorrow, his healing, his quiet gratitude. He ran his fingers through her fur, grounding himself in the warmth of the moment. Life had taken so much, but it had given him this, a chance to feel again, to love again. Freya licked his hand once, a silent vow between them. They had found each other in the storm, and they had saved each other. As they turned back toward the cabin, the heavy clouds that had loomed for days parted, allowing golden sunlight to spill through the trees. It touched everything, the earth, the air, and Mark's heart. He paused, letting it wash over him. Freya sat beside him, her gaze fixed ahead, her pups tumbling in the soft grass. He smiled, a small, quiet thing, but real, a promise of something more, of life moving forward, of hope, fragile but unwavering, blooming anew. Mark never expected a stray dog to change his life, but Freya proved that love often comes when we least expect it. The moment she entered his home, shivering and afraid, neither of them realized how much they needed each other. What began as a simple act of kindness soon turned into a bond that defied all logic, a connection forged in the cold, yet warmed by trust and companionship. Freya's unwavering loyalty and Mark's willingness to open his heart remind us that trust is the foundation of healing. She had every reason to fear humans, yet she placed her faith in him. And Mark, a man burdened by his own past, learned to trust again through her silent understanding. Together, they proved that trust isn't built in a day. It grows through patience, through quiet moments of reassurance, and through the unspoken promise to never give up on each other. The storm wasn't just about survival. It was a test of resilience, faith, and the courage to embrace a second chance. When the blizzard raged outside, threatening to consume everything in its path, Mark and Freya clung to the hope that they could make it through. But the real storm wasn't the one outside. It was the one inside Mark, the storm of loneliness, regret, and the fear of letting someone in again. And Freya, with her gentle eyes and steady presence, became the calm that guided him home. Mark thought he was rescuing Freya, but in the end, she saved him just as much. She filled the empty spaces in his life with love, purpose, and a quiet understanding that no words could express. Sometimes the ones we save become our greatest healers, teaching us that love, in all its forms, has the power to mend even the most broken of hearts. And as Mark watched Freya curl up by his side, he realized he hadn't just found a dog. He had found family.